So I'm pleased to start our last session of the conference, but before I did that, we just wanted to pay tribute to one of our delegates here today, because in 4 weeks' time, it is the 55th anniversary of AMBA and BGA. In fact, we were founded not as AMBA, we were founded as BGA in 1967. And when thinking about it yesterday, it struck us that there is one person in this room who has been a pioneer of this industry for almost as long as our organization has been in existence. And that's you, Jorge Talavera, almost 50 years in the industry. So what you have done for ESAN, for Cladea, for Latin America business schools in general, and also as a great supporter of AMBA and BGA, thank you so much. Okay, so from one giant of Latin America to one giant of North America, we wanted this last session to be a very open session with a global dean of global experience, and of course John, you know, great Harvard career, Dean of London Business School, leader at CEIBS, and now at Miami Business School. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a few questions for John on stage of some of the big issues affecting the industry, and then we're going to open it to the floor, so feel free to ask any questions you would like. So John, if you'd like to join me on stage, that would be great. So let's just check our mics are working fine. Can you hear us both?
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, good. All right, great, thank you. So John, I'd like to start talking about a market we haven't really talked about, but that's next door, and that is the USA. Ever since I joined AMBA in 2013, I've had journalists coming on to me saying, the MBA is going to suffer in the States, there's too many business schools in the States, a third of them will go bust. And I hear it the whole time, it's like a cliche, but it hasn't really happened. How do you foresee the future for business schools in the USA over the next 3 to 5 years, and also the MBA in the USA in particular?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thanks a lot for the invitation to be here for the final session, and I've really enjoyed meeting many of you, and look forward to collaborations with University of Miami and those of you in the region. We really appreciate the support and the accreditation, of course. So the MBA was, as you know, founded or inaugurated over 100 years ago now, and it stood the test of time. Why has it stood the test of time? I think two main reasons. One is the people in this room who typically are not sitting teaching the same thing for year upon year, but are sensitive to the evolving environment and are adapting their curricula and content according to what businesses and organizations beyond business need at a particular time. So the MBA has proven itself to be a very adaptive organism, and it represents an umbrella under which there can be constant evolution of content. Now, as far as the structure of the industry in North America is concerned, it's a very low barrier to entry industry because essentially pre-online, all you needed was a blackboard and a piece of chalk and a professor. You didn't need to invest in laboratory equipment like you would find in most departments at Imperial, for example, in order to get into business schools. So there was a very low barrier to entry and tremendous amount of demand for folks who were trained in this fashion. And then over time, of course, as more people came into the industry, there became more and more competitive pressure. And if you fast forward to today, you have demographics in the US that are not favorable to the age band for the for the typical MBA degree entrant. You have that demographic pressure, and then on top of that you have what I think is dangerous and where AMBA comes into play, where you have a overcapacity in the industry, you then have the temptation to dumb down your requirements. And that could take the form of shifting from a 2-year to a 1-year program. It can take the form of relaxation of entry requirements for students. And all in all, when this happens repeatedly in the industry, it dilutes the value of the MBA degree if there are too many people wandering around with it who frankly don't pass muster. And so that is really, I think, the principal threat to the MBA at the moment, is simply the proliferation of these degrees, which are being held by people who have less and less of a stature based on the content of education that's been given to them. And I think it's an issue that we have to pay attention to, aggravated by online and all of the challenges associated with online MBAs as well. Interestingly enough, I did see a recent survey, you may have seen it as well, which indicated that there was a 20-point increase in the percentage of employers who viewed an online MBA as equivalent to an in-residence MBA. And I thought that shift during COVID was quite a significant shift to observe. Whether or not that will stand the test of time, whether all of the online MBAs are up to, on average, the same level as the full-time in-residence MBAs remains to be seen.
And that's the golden goal of some of these online providers, isn't it? To get the evidence that employers now value the qualification in parallel of the same quality as a degree. And interesting, as a Harvard alum, I got a proud email from the dean showing that employers are rating the Harvard Business School online MBA as highly, in some of the little stack certificates, employers were really valuing them highly. So even Harvard are trying to get credibility for their online. Of those business schools, about 2,000 in the States. Mm-hmm. In 10 years' time, how many do you believe there'll be in the States? And we won't quote you on this, by the way.
You know, I think most universities and colleges really see a business school as a very important cash cow that cross-subsidizes other elements of their activities that aren't necessarily so profitable. And so I think you'll see most universities and colleges resist the facing up to the fact that their business school is not up to snuff. Now, this is where I think the accreditation bodies can be extremely helpful in terms of sustaining and enforcing standards so that the degrees are not diluted and not dumbed down. But I don't think most universities and colleges are going to be interested in saying, hey, our business school is underperforming and therefore we're not going to do it anymore. They want the cash flow from those business students, no matter what their quality may be.
So you think even the purportedly weak ones will keep going?
Yes, and I think I mentioned yesterday to a couple of people after Bodo's very good presentation with Steve that one of the reasons for the continuity of these schools and the lack of M&A activity in this arena is actually the alumni issue. So
yeah, of course,
alumni fiercely resist any M&A activity. And that is, when you think about it, an important component of what many business schools sell to their new students is the notion you're going to become part of this very special club of alumni of your school. So there's a lot of obstacles in the way of. And you only have to look at the case of Thunderbird that was mentioned. The amount of furor that was associated with Thunderbird being absorbed by ASU was enormous.
Great. If we move on now to the transformation post-COVID, so we had face-to-face learning, then a rapid transformation to hybrid or online. What do you see post-COVID as the optimum balance, firstly for your own school, of return to face-to-face, blended and hybrid?
So at Miami, as some of you may know, we have a very strong undergraduate program. Around about 3,200 students in our undergraduate program, and that program is a 4-year program which actually now has more students enrolled than in the College of Arts and Sciences of the University of Miami. Now, I know we're mainly focused on graduate programs here, but let me just say that the University of Miami campus is a beautiful residential campus. And so in my opinion, there's always going to be significant demand for a 4-year residential campus experience in a great location. And therefore, in that respect, our university does not have to embrace online in the undergraduate space. But there's no doubt that in the graduate space, COVID's accelerated the move to legitimize and increase the acceptability of online delivery of programs. And I expect to see that continue. And whether or not it's a mixture of full-time residential plus fully online plus some combination of the two for executive MBAs, most schools will need to, if they're not already, will need to have multiple variants for multiple segments of the market. The danger is, and we confront this at Miami, the danger is that in the effort to accommodate multiple segments of the market, you end up with a scale problem in some of these optional versions of an MBA program. So you end up with 20 students in a cohort in a nighttime MBA, just to give you one that none of you have implemented yet, but I think it's coming. And actually, when I was at London Business School 24 years ago, just for fun, I actually proposed in a faculty meeting that because we wanted to make our facilities as effectively used as possible, that we launch a nighttime MBA where, from midnight to 6 a.m., the classrooms would be open to students at a discounted rate. Now, here's the really scary thing. 3 faculty members wrote to me in all seriousness saying, I would love to teach on that program. Okay, okay, that is very scary. So I think that's where the problem is. It refers to my mass customization question to the speaker to back. Yeah. Mass customization is great as long as you have sufficient scale in each of the product variants that you're offering. And what I'm nervous about, and we face it ourselves, is an over-segmentation in a way that results in scale inefficiencies and complexity costs that cost us our effectiveness in the market. And if you over-segment, then of course you are risking, let's say, 20 people in a cohort, and then the attractiveness of the networking opportunity across a 2-year period, of course, is gone. Now, what we do is we cross-fertilize these enrollees in different programs so that they are, in classes with people from other programs as well. So we do that. They are not clearly siloed. And that helps, of course, but that's a big risk, I think.
So that leads very neatly into the next question, this talk about capacity building. A lot of deans have spoken to the team and I over the last year saying, look, professors moved fairly willingly from face-to-face to hybrid teaching, but the extra workload and pressure, the mode of teaching, the student follow-up afterwards, where you couldn't just pass them on to a classroom assistant, the follow-up of questions by email, the faculty were exhausted, and their view was that that hybrid teaching, if you haven't got endless budget to increase the size of your faculty, is not sustainable. How do you recommend managing and motivating hybrid teaching faculty who are saying the workload is really high?
Okay, so let's distinguish between two things. So one definition of hybrid teaching is you have a particular course where there are some students who are online and some face-to-face in the classroom. And I think the collective experience is that proved especially difficult and onerous for folks to manage, even if they had a TA in the room with them to help spot what was happening in terms of online students raising their hand. The other definition of hybrid is that there are some complete courses that are taught hybrid and some that are taught face-to-face, or that there is some residency component and some online component. So if you go back 20 plus years to when Duke University, and Blair Shepherd was mentioned on one of Layla's slides, when Blair Shepherd started at Duke, there was a big furor about exactly what you're talking about, the amount of excess work that the faculty felt was involved in the delivery of online courses. Now, part of that was because the technology was clunky early on, but the conundrum for us is that there are potentially extra costs associated due to student expectations and the timing of expectations. In other words, I want to send my question at 1 a.m. and I expect an answer by 8 a.m.
Yeah.
So there are extra costs associated with that. At the same time, there is still the notion in the market that the online should be charged at lower pricing than the face-to-face. So you have potentially a higher cost structure at the same time as you have a market expectation for lower pricing. So this is really going to be a challenge. And I have to say, one of the most interesting cases which I'm familiar with to a degree at the moment is the $24,000 MBA at Boston University, that online program at BU. I would love to see them try and get AMBA accreditation, by the way, but that's a different story. In fact, perhaps AMBA should publish a list of U.S. business schools that would never be accredited by AMBA. That would really help us in Miami if you can fix that.
That's a great idea.
Enough, or else I'm going to get into trouble soon. Someone's already sending an email on their phone to the dean of BU.
Let's talk about student movement between North America and Latin America.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a common feeling now that a lot of Latin American students would rather go, perhaps culturally, to Spain and Europe rather than the States. How do you see the flow over the next 3 years of Latin America students to the USA? Practically, how can our Latin American schools get more students, even if it's exchange, not on permanent programs from North America?
So I think it's going to be challenging is the answer, because obviously the exchange rate at the moment is not conducive to the flow. And in addition, one has to acknowledge, that Josep and, the other very good Spanish schools have done a very good job of offering options in the Latin American market at lower prices than R1 universities, Research 1 universities like Miami can offer, given our cost structure. On the other hand, the political developments in the region are such that there is probably a higher appetite these days, in particular for making sure that family members have some sort of base in the US and potentially Miami is a very attractive
Obviously,
place. If
yeah.
you're going to do a STEM certified 10-month Masters in Finance or Masters in Business Analytics, which gives the 3-year opportunity to stay in the U.S. for practical training for work after you finish in only 10 months, Miami is probably a pretty good place to put in to lower your anchor, let's put it that way. In terms of traffic in the other direction, it is certainly a challenge. There's no doubt that we have, at the undergraduate level, perhaps a little bit more success in terms of exchange students. But at the graduate level, it's very difficult for 2 reasons for us. One is the level of content that is stuffed into our programs makes them very intensive and difficult for students to transfer for a semester to a Latin American school. No matter how good it is, there's going to be a content issue even on elective courses. So the second reason is, it's a little bit hubristic to mention it, but many of our students come to Miami because they want to be in Miami, and it's not like being in West Lafayette, Indiana, for example, where you might actually want to go overseas or go somewhere different. Obviously, we sell Miami as a very multicultural destination in the first place, and so people who come to us don't necessarily think that they need to go international. Now, one of the things that we have done, and Cecilia Sanchez, who's sitting back here as our International Affairs Manager, knows this particularly well, and that is what we call our GLOBE projects. And the GLOBE projects have been successfully run with graduate students from our school in Latin America in collaboration with graduate students at other schools in Latin America. So these are consulting projects where there is a number of schools represented in each team, and they then are able to go and conduct collaborative consulting work in Latin American companies. And that, I won't say we have hundreds of students who are signing up for this every year, but it's an important part of our effort to reach out to Latin America. I go back a long way in Latin America. I used to be on the advisory board of IAE in Buenos Aires 30 years ago when it was a fledgling institution. And I think, what has happened in Latin America with business schools developing and some private, some public popping up, it's actually been exceptionally healthy for Latin America. And I'm sure if we did an economic development impact of all of the work of all of the business schools in Latin America, it would be a very, very significant economic impact. So, kudos to everybody in this room who's been a part of that development.
Amazing.
At the same time, I hear even at the University of Miami, it's very interesting. There are some people who say, Latin America, the Caribbean. I always like to include the Caribbean as well because they always get left out. But from our point of view, we're neighbors of Jamaica and other Caribbean countries. And so, collectively, I think it's in everybody's interest here to think about the Caribbean as well as Latin America. So what I find, even at my own institution, is people who say, that's too restrictive an ambition, that we want to be a global university, not a hemispheric university, okay? So you can imagine why some people would have that point of view. Now, my attitude is, yes, I agree with that, but the fact is Latin America is sitting right there in our backyard, and I think that you always have to take responsibility as well as seizing the opportunity that comes from being a neighbor, and we want to be a good neighbor and be as helpful as we can.
Very
And
good.
so, that's one reason why there are 4 of us here today.
No, very good.
When I arrived, the Miami Herbert Business School was not a member of BALAS. It was not a member of CLADIA. It was basically doing nothing in Latin America. So gradually we're trying to earn your trust that we're, serious players here.
Very good, very good. Thank you, John. Just moving further afield now to China. At this conference in Cusco in 2018, for the first time we had 5 Chinese deans. When it moved to Quito 2019, we had 10 Chinese deans. And this time around, Jungming Wang, our Carlos Ramos in China, assured me that if the Chinese had been able to travel here, we'd have had 25 to 30 Chinese deans. So firstly from a North America and then secondly from a Latin America perspective, geopolitically, what do you think will happen in terms of students from China coming into North America? And how realistic do you think it is, given the language and cultural differences, that there would be major student Chinese populations coming to study in Latin America?
So regarding the U.S., the Wall Street Journal, I think it was perhaps 5 weeks ago, reported that the China applications for student visas, not the applications, the China student visas issued for entry into the U.S. were 50% lower this year than the year before. And in terms of our own enrollments, we were down 40% in terms of Chinese enrollments in our graduate programs. We're not so concerned with the undergraduate program in the sense that we have 50,000 applicants university-wide for 2,500 university places each year, and we have about 750 or so of those students. That's not where we're concerned. We're concerned at the graduate level, and we saw, as I said, about a 40% reduction in Chinese graduate student enrollments at our school. This is a significant, it's not crucial, it's not existential, but it's a very significant revenue hit. And it surprised me because actually, given my own experience, and I'm reasonably well known in China, we're a very China-friendly school. We're not viewed as a school that has any problems whatsoever with respect to the way in which Chinese students are received or their level of safety, psychological or physical, on our campus or in Miami. That's not on the radar. So I was surprised to see this level of fall off. One thing that people don't, I think, fully understand is the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party is really seeking to upgrade the quality of their own universities and their own business schools. And when I was in China working there, say 14 years ago, there was a very well-known phrase in China was that we want your money, we want your technology, and we want you out. Okay, and so having suckered the West into providing the money and the technology. And in our sense, showing what business education looks like when it's done properly, they now are not so interested, I think, in having lots of people coming here. They would rather have them go to their own universities. It does require the Chinese higher education system be cleaned up in terms of the corruption that is associated with promotion and tenure appointments in those universities, but in many cases that house cleaning has been done and is being done. And we should all be aware of that. So I think that particular issue bears upon Chinese students in Latin America as much as it does in the US. If you were the Chinese Communist Party, the people you would be sending to Latin America are people you want to have learn Spanish and become spies on behalf of China in Latin America. So I know that, I'm talking as an American, and of course there is a balancing act that every Latin American country should correctly go through in terms of its best interests being served by China or by the US or a combination of the two. But I think that the notion that there is going to be a flock of genuinely motivated business students coming to Latin America, if they're not coming to the US, they're not going to come to Latin America. I don't think, unless we're talking about countries that are signing, deep agreements with the Communist Party of China, and that's part of the equation.
Part of the deal.
Yeah.
Great. Final question before we open it to the floor. Responsible management now is a key component of every school's MBA program. Do you think there's a risk with all the current geopolitical dramas and crises that the eye might come off the ball of responsible management and sustainability through sheer practical reasons of dealing with current geopolitical and economic problems?
So I remember in 2008 I published an article, I think it was called Can CSR Survive the Recession? And obviously the argument was in favor of continuance. So I think that 14 years later, we're in a position where stakeholder considerations vis-a-vis shareholder considerations have grown in recognition to the point where it's unlikely that it's going to be thrown under the bus, okay? But I would highlight two caveats. One is whenever there's a recession, and let's assume that we're either in one or we're going into one in 2023, whenever there's a recession, there's going to be a renewed emphasis on accounting, and accounting usually becomes more important, finance becomes more important, economics becomes more important, marketing becomes less important, and so my notion would be that CSR and sustainability and so forth, that could be a bit on the back burner. I mean, let's face it, we see that in terms of the way in which the energy crunch is being handled these days, with a reversion to reopening coal-fired plants and talking again about nuclear in a big way. So I think it's going to be tougher to push that agenda, but it's not going to go away. But the second caveat I would also introduce is around the recent research on ESG's connection to shareholder value. And many of you will be familiar with a significant body of research that has highlighted that there is a connection, that if you invest in ESG initiatives, you drive stock price up. And this research has been heavily challenged in the last year, as some of you may know, where other researchers have contended that there's essentially a tautology associated with the argument that, in fact, well-run companies generate higher shareholder value and higher profit margins, some of which can then be thrown at ESG initiatives, rather than the ESG initiatives causing the shareholder value. So, that's an interesting research conundrum that now confronts everybody who's been advocating strongly for investments in sustainability and so forth. One thing I'd just like to underscore is slightly taking a different point of view on this than Layla took. That, as you know, we have a very well-known MS in sustainable business at our school, which is STEM certified. And when we went down that, I think it's still the only STEM certified MS in sustainable business in the US. Now, when we went down that route, I felt it was very important that we walk the talk on our buildings. So all of our buildings were LEED certified, LEED certified for operations and maintenance at the gold level. I think we're probably moving, if we're lucky, we should hear soon that we're certified at platinum level now, 3 years later. But if you are pushing CSR, if you're pushing sustainability and you're not paying attention to what's happening in your own building, and you have, you know, thousands of these on display, you know, someone's going to ask, how
genuine is this?
Isn't this hypocritical?
Yeah. Very good. Look, John, thank you so much. We've got 11 minutes flashing at me, so over to you, the audience, for some questions. Layla at the front.
Thank you so much, John. I would have like 100 questions, but I will try and reduce it to one. On the China situation, when you and this is a very specific question, so do excuse, but when you say that the visa applications are 50% down, is it that they're not getting the visa? So is it a registry issue, or is it that they're actually declining the visas and not coming anymore? So is it an attraction issue?
Understood. It's both. The 50% figure actually refers to issuance rather than applications, but the applications are way down as well. You know, thanks to the previous president's policies towards China, which have basically made the U.S., even though it has I think it's fair to say, very good business schools, vis-a-vis Australia, the UK, and Canada, that the US is less attractive to Chinese parents to send their sons and daughters to, given the political climate between China and the US. So I think, you know, we basically, through the tariff war and so on, shot the U.S. reputation in the foot. And funnily enough, but understandably, it didn't show up in the data for a couple of years, because, you know, when you're planning an overseas degree program, you know, to take an MBA or an MS overseas, that's a 1 year or a 2 year planning horizon. Very few people are going to make that choice in the 1 month or two before the program starts. So you don't actually see the negative consequence showing. It's rather like the lag effect when you stop advertising. You know, the sales don't fall off a cliff immediately, but, you know, a year later, if you haven't done any advertising, all of a sudden you really see a massive drop. And I think that's what's happened here. It's been a lag effect that has finally come home to roost.
Thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. I just wonder what your view is on conference travel and faculty mobility, because you just talked about certification of buildings. Now, as soon as a significant number of faculty goes to conferences on a regular basis, there may be some pressure in terms of saying, well, look, your carbon footprint is getting ridiculous, and symbolically, it's not particularly good. On the other hand, of course, we know all the advantages of face-to-face meetings and so on. Where do you think this is going?
So I think academic conferences, in particular, there's still a strong appetite to have face-to-face meetings. And particularly when you're using those conferences for reviewing and recruiting new faculty, it's very difficult to argue that the face-to-face is not critical in terms of those decisions. In addition, I mean, let's be frank about it, A lot of us do like to attend conferences a few times a year. I mean, it's part of the benefits package, if you like, of being a faculty member, that you get to go off and meet some of your peers 2 or 3 times a year. So my personal view is that that is likely to continue, but I think that what we're finding is that with respect to, if you like, seminars that might be involving 1 or 2 faculty members at other universities who are not being recruited per se, but instead of them coming to the school, there's a lot more opportunity for those to be online and for more people to come as guests for 1 hour online. Just segueing from that a little bit, I mean, we found during the COVID era that with our Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series, which previously had been totally in person, we of course had to take that online. And you know, the 2 positive consequences were, first of all, we were able to attract speakers who would never have invested the time to come down to Miami, like Steve Schwartzman, for example, at Blackstone. And in addition, it enabled us to reach out to our alumni all over the world who obviously would not be able to show up in person at live events. So what we're doing now is maintaining a combination of online and in-person events, and I suspect that that pattern will be the same for the conferences that you're referring to. I can hear you nevertheless, yeah.
Okay. All Latin American people go and go to study in USA, but sometimes my concern regardless to how can we attract students to go to Latin America? Because like we are, well, I will talk about my country. We are not Miami, so we are not, we don't have such nice maybe sites, but we have some interesting sites. But which would be some competitive advantage that might be where the attractive for like the students from USA? Maybe, I don't know, culture. We are experts on, I don't know, how you say, inflation. We are experts on, on what else? On micro credits. So what would be some things that might be attractive for students from United States to come to Latin America? I know, for example, people from Miami already speak Spanish, so that would not be a really attractive point of view. So please, some suggestions.
Okay. So I want to tell you a little story regarding your inflation point. So I used to, when I was a young professor, I used to specialize in temporary price discounts. So that was where I kind of parked my tent for the purposes of being promoted to associate professor. And you know, I had this wonderful company call me from, I think it was from Buenos Aires, and they wanted me to come down and do a day on temporary price promotions and how to run sales promotions. So I packed up all of my slides and went down to Buenos Aires, you know, just to run into hyperinflation, where running a sales promotion meant that you kind of raised your price at 3 p.m. instead of 2 p.m. like everybody else raised their price, if you see what I mean, right? So all of my slides were completely irrelevant. Fortunately, I remember I had a slide carousel that had 100 pictures of point of purchase displays. And so I remember, I think I scheduled maybe 1 hour for that. I took 4 hours meticulously going through these 100 because all of my slides regarding sales promotion were rendered irrelevant by the hyperinflation. So I think especially for economists and finance students from emerging economies, you know, those kinds of experiences, not that it has to be hyperinflation, I'm just using that as an example, but there are different circumstances that are facing Latin American based companies and governments, and you know, we ought to drive those through our curricula, and maybe not as compulsory courses, but certainly as electives. So Cecilia can you know, help here a little bit because we have a Latin America advisory board, and one of the co-chairs of that board is the owner and CEO of Hyper Maxi in Bolivia, who is actually an alum of our school. And so I don't know that the globe trips that I've referred to earlier have ever included Bolivia, but you know, potentially that might be the case. So let's connect with Cecilia to see if we can figure out something.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Very good. Jorge. Appropriately, Jorge, you get the final word.
Well, John, you make an excellent presentation, and you gave us very valuable information. But I'm a little surprised because some schools, very well-known schools in the States, have a very good experience in Latin America. We heard what happened in Central America with INCAE, for example, a very nice history with Harvard, with the support of AID and so on. So the same with Stanford in Peru.
Yes.
Very nice history also. And Wharton support a business school in Venezuela, Michigan State University in Brazil with one very well-known school in Brazil, and I can say several experiences quite successful. Also, there were some failures. I'm not going to say the names, but there was a school in Texas, very well known, that create a school in Madrid and create a school in South America, and with the name they have, with the professors and the support, they fail. Well, I know more or less the reason why they fail, but why, with these good experiences, they don't continue to working in Latin America? And also, if you see some opportunities for Latin America to start a campus in USA. There are some places they speak Spanish, and they can attract students locally and from Latin America. I know that some schools are creating campuses in Miami and in other parts of the U.S. What do you think about this? You see an opportunity to continue some successful in Latin America for universities in USA?
So on the broader issue, looking back historically, it's interesting that Harvard and Stanford, for example, saw part of their social responsibility, though they didn't put it that way at the time, saw part of their social responsibility to bring high quality business education to the world. And at one point, for example, Harvard Business School actually had a campus in Tehran, in Iran, before the Shah was thrown out. And then, you know, we had faculty members in Tehran who had to be pulled out on an emergency basis. So, in a way, before the world was global and before globalization, there was a sense of responsibility around international outreach that these schools pursued. I think in a way, curiously enough, that as globalization became more of a norm and the flows of human capital and financial capital became much easier across national boundaries, that the sense that we were engaged in missionary activity, altruistic missionary activity, that had faded off somewhat. And so, you know, as all of the Latin American schools, not all, but as many Latin American schools, such as ESAN and IAE and BA and Los Andes, as they gradually improved greatly in stature and competency, the tendency was to let go and not necessarily sustain the close ties that had been in place when perhaps there was viewed as being a little bit of a parent-child relationship with these schools. So I know that these ties still do exist, and in some cases stronger than others, and usually the bonds are a function of faculty members as much as they are of the institution. We in Miami, you know, for example, I mean, we have collaborations with FGV and Centrum on the delivery of executive education programs, and you know, we would love to have more of those collaborations, and are very open to immersions for folks from your business schools, 1-week immersions for executive MBAs, for example. I think where I see the challenge is in the balance of trade. You know, we don't want to be takers, we want to be givers as well as takers and have a fair balance of trade. And that's where the challenge comes in terms of finding ways in which, especially as a research university, finding ways in which our faculty can be supportive and at the same time sending students, as we've already discussed, on exchanges. But you know, I personally found that I was on the advisory board of IAE, as I mentioned, and also of another school in Ecuador called IDE, which is on the highway outside of Guayaquil. And I personally found as a younger faculty member that it was a great personal development opportunity to be on these advisory boards. And I still have very good relationships with those schools, and of course continue to help whenever I can. So I have faculty who would be ideal for that role for schools in Latin America, and whom I'm sure would be keen to be helpful and have the bandwidth to do so. So, you know, if that would be a way in which we could give support, that would be something worth pursuing as well. I hope that's helpful.
Very good. John, an absolutely fascinating range of answers. Thank you so
Okay,
much for
Andrew,
joining us.
thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Quelch.